Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of Ctrl-alt-Delete. Today I am joined by Richard Tiplady. It's great to have you with us, Richard.
Thank you, Stewart. It's great to be here.
And it's great for all kinds of reasons, but particularly because fairly recently you fell off a mountain, and people might have seen you on the BBC and Channel 4 and that kind of thing. You're subject of a documentary because you are in fact a walking miracle.
Well, I'm walking. Yes, I did. I bounced off the hill back in March, just before lockdown. But yes, fully recovered from a few broken bones and scratches and scrapes. Thanks.
Yeah. Brilliant. It's we're glad you've made such a full recovery, because it must have been an incredibly worrying time for everybody.
Thank you. Yeah. I think it was. Not so much for me. I was in the middle of it all, but yeah, my wife was a bit concerned. I think it's fair to say.
Well, that's good.
Yeah. Yes, that's true.
I'm glad she was a bit worried, at least.
Better that than the opposite.
Yeah, not bothered.
Yeah.
Richard, you and I have crossed paths a number of times over the years. You were the principal at International Christian College, and then its next incarnation of the Scottish School for Christian Ministry. And now you work with the Scottish Episcopal Institute. So education and learning have been a thing that you are hugely passionate about.
Very much. And theological education and formation for ministry and mission in the UK, and particularly with all the challenges that the church is facing, not just for today, but as we're facing over the last decade or so. What's the nature of the church? What's the scope of the church? What's the point of the church, if you like?
Great question. So what is the point of the church? What in a sentence?
Yeah, I set myself up for that one, didn't I? Really? Well, we're here to make Christ known, aren't we? And invite people to follow him. We're here to be the body of Christ, his representative on earth. I love the description that Paul gives of the church in 1 Thessalonians, and James says that we are actually part of the first fruits of the resurrection, which is a very scary challenge.
Isn't it just?
But we are meant to be showing to the world society as God intends it, and bringing around foretastes of that new world in our world today. That's what we're about. So
in terms of your role then, it's about preparing and sustaining leaders and challenging people to think differently. There go the dogs. What particularly now, I think for many people, what this period seems to be is almost a distillation of years and years of change in the church and kind of moving towards something different. So what are the big issues you think around for the church at the moment in terms of this particular period, but also the stuff that's been coming? Yeah,
great. Again, great questions and small questions. Thanks for asking those little questions. I agree with you entirely. That what COVID is doing is not really bringing too much that's new, but it's accelerating things that were already happening, and bringing lots of things out into the daylight to allow us to see it. Before I talk about the church itself, I'm actually quite concerned about what's happening more broadly in our society, and again, what I think COVID has accelerated, but what we do about that as a church. So things like the economic and social impacts of lockdown. 2.1 million people, new families applying for universal credit in the first 2 months after lockdown. Debt workers announcing a huge rise in family debt. So many families within one payday of being in serious financial difficulties. Huge rise in the number of food banks. More than double the number of children being supported by food banks. And that was just in the very early days when the furlough system was still kicking in. So goodness, what we're going to see in the next year or two. And for all the focus that I think we've had in the church on getting online, supporting people through our services online and reaching out to people online. And I commend that, and thinking about how we get back to church, which I actually is a phrase I really, really want. I wish we wouldn't use, because I don't think we want to get back to anything, because it wasn't working very well, let's be honest. But for all our focus on ourselves, I really think we need to be focusing as much on, well, what's happening out there and what are we as God's people called to do? And actually, what are we doing? Because I think there's an amazing amount of things already happening, but what are we called to do to serve others as well in a pretty grim time in people's lives? So I'm very keen that we think beyond ourselves, but also think about, I suppose, what opportunities this gives us We've been forced to stop an awful lot of things, almost everything, a great number of things. And I am concerned that as we eventually re-emerge, blinking into the daylight, into this new normal or different normal or whatever it looks like, that we rush back to what we had because it's comfortable and we know it. I think we saw a bit of that in the summer when the first lockdown ended. It seemed to me July could be summarized as the Christians ran back to church and everybody else ran to the beach or Spain. We'd missed stuff, and we had the opportunity to go back and get back the things we like. And I don't blame anyone for that. We lived the lives we lived because we liked doing these things. Yeah. But not only was that rush back to normality actually very short-lived, as we saw the second wave hit, ironically, particularly our wider social behaviours probably caused the second wave, all the mass eating out and, the new strain of COVID that came from Spain because we all went on holiday there, or many people did. And so I'm actually very concerned that we take a bit of time and use this time to draw breath and to ask big questions about what we're doing, why we're doing it. Normally you can't take a church off the road, like you could take a vehicle off the road to repair it. But for the first time ever, I suspect, or certainly in our lives, we've been taken off the road.
Yeah, it's something I used to say quite a lot when I was visiting people. The problem with making change is that you have to stop stuff, and we never have the opportunity to do that.
It's quite difficult to change a wheel in a car on the motorway while you're driving. Yeah. It's a tricky, it's a tricky thing to do. Never actually tried it.
Yeah, and don't. And I think as someone who is now a minister in a parish, that's actually magnified, because some of that's about to create the space to enable people to think about that is really difficult when everything's going, as you say, you're hurtling down at 70 miles an hour, and it all just keeps going. Everything's about making it continue to go, and the driving analogy only works if you pull over and stop and get out the car and go and get some food or petrol or but even then it's about making the car continue to go. You're going to get back in and keep going. So,
and maybe it's a case of accepting that we're maybe on the wrong path, or that that maybe we need to look at the map and take some time, that the sat nav was wrong, or was not necessarily guiding us the best route. But it's not easy to do, and I accept that actually it's not even been easy to do in lockdown, because there has been the pressure to keep some kind of show on the road. That's taken an awful lot of work and energy, and a lot of people have learned an awful lot of new skills and done awfully well with it. But a lot of church leaders and are just tired out now. A lot of churches are tired out, and if we could all just go, well, actually we're coming up to Christmas now. There's Advent and there's Christmas, but after Christmas we're going to take a break. Maybe we could take a slightly longer break and stop, and think a bit about, well, okay, what actually have we laid down that could stay laid down, and can we create some space? I'm going to push the metaphor a bit, or change the metaphor. If we clear the weeds, what could we plant instead? But that takes a lot of clearing, a lot of work to clear, to stop, to draw breath, and take some time to go, well, okay, we've stopped this treadmill, we've stopped this rush, this busyness. What could or should we be doing instead? And not to rush at that, but to take some real time to think about it, and move tentatively and cautiously and experimentally and humbly and quietly into that, rather than rushing back to things, I think and take not just a couple of months of that, but maybe the whole next year or the next couple of years over that.
Do you think? Yes, that sounds fantastic. However, so I'll throw in the however. The however is that there'll be huge pressure from both members and the denominations to get back, because apart from anything else, there's there are buildings and stipends and all the things that some of the keeping the show on the road has become about. It's about maintaining property and income.
Yeah.
And to stop puts all of that in jeopardy, although it's already in jeopardy. You know, we haven't opened. We never did. You know, we didn't. We kept having the meeting the day before we get put back into lockdown. So in some ways, I'm really pleased about that. It wasn't until I was chatting to Susie Farrant the other day for the last episode, and she said maybe actually reopening has just reinforced some of the really bad practice that we have, because it can only be one person at the front talking.
Interesting.
Now, and yes. I hadn't given that any consideration at all. Everybody, you know, it's usually a fairly passive experience, but it's even more passive now.
Yes.
Because you have to sit and, you know, don't move, don't say anything, and leave as soon as we tell you, kind of thing. So actually going back might be worse in some senses than, than taking the opportunity you've described.
Oh, and I suppose it's a case of let's not rush back to just do a sort of ersatz version of a service as if that's what we do, but actually spend a bit of time thinking, can we fundamentally rethink what we ought to do and how we go about being the church, reframe it. I'll come back to that if that's okay. But because I think your point that things weren't working brilliantly anyway. I mean, we were putting off the evil day in lots of churches. You know, churches we've talked a lot about churches just hanging on by the skin of the teeth. And if we're not careful, all we do is end up thinking, well, as long as I can sustain it so it doesn't fall apart on my watch, then it's someone else's problem. And I think that's a real dereliction of duty. Yeah. I think that's a real failure on our part if we just think that as long as it doesn't collapse while I'm in charge, then stuff the next person, they can pick up the pieces. You need to stop earlier. I mean, that was the example of what I did at ICC. Mm-hmm. I could see what was coming down the road, and that ICC was not going to be sustainable for more than 2 or 3 more years. And I couldn't in good conscience allow people to start studying in the college knowing that it was unlikely to be there when they finished. That was unjust and unfair on them. And so we made a decision to stop while we still had resources and assets and try something new. Now, it was a very costly thing to do to many people, myself included. It cost me quite a lot, I'll be honest. But I don't think we had any choice. And, you know, I've heard conversations, commonplaces up here in terms of 20% of churches will never reopen properly. I have a friend who works for a diocese in England. I won't say which it is because the research hasn't yet been published, but he's shared some of his early findings with me that they've just undertaken a substantial participative inquiry process within the diocese, and have identified that clearly 15% of their churches will never reopen. And there's a lot of churches that have got a very small number of people trying to sustain something. And they anticipate in the next few years that something like 40 to 50% of the people that used to come to their churches will no longer come. That it's a very, very substantial wastage, for want of a better word, that we're going to see. But what was really positive about what he said was some of the findings they discovered that were much more optimistic. So that's the loss side of things. But on the other hand, they've seen this massive shift in focus to personal discipleship and people taking personal responsibility for their spiritual lives and nurturing themselves and one another rather than turn up at church and someone does it for me. Yeah. They've seen this shift, if you like, from the temple to the home. It's a bit like when the temple collapsed in Jerusalem and the synagogues emerged in the Old Testament. I mean, I know we can push the exile metaphor a bit much sometimes, but it's an interesting analogy. They've seen a big focus in lay leadership, in pioneer ministry experiments going on. So these are all really positive things that have happened in just a very short space of time that are probably going to be very substantial positive outcomes for the future of the church, and are probably the things we wanted to have happen anyway. Yeah. So clearing the decks, as it were, to create room for new growth is possibly a metaphor I want to push, really.
Yeah, and I think hugely important. We've been talking about fresh expressions for years and years. And the excuse I gave earlier about I'm just far too busy to do this is in some cases actually very real. Because the whole thing is so time consuming that to to build a new community takes time and effort and investment, you know, and if the expectation is on one person to go do that, you know, you're the minister, you've got the training, off you go, you know, go and build us a new church, please. I mean, that's just, you know,
it's
clearly,
never going to happen, is it?
Yeah,
no,
yeah,
no.
yeah.
And yet the evidence from, and we've been really slow around pioneer ministry of fresh expressions in Scotland. Doesn't matter what denomination. We've really not taken hold of it. And it's not a silver bullet. It's not the answer to everything, but it brings something. But I think that the potential is there for us now to begin to explore things. I mean, the great learning from the early research in the Church of England that Church Army did is that the vast majority of fresh expressions are lay-led anyway. The role of a church leader is much more about permission giving and enabling rather than doing it. Only 2% of fresh expressions were started by an ordained pioneer minister. I mean, now that's partly a function of numbers. There aren't many of them. But the vast majority, in fact, the highest number was this wonderful phrase, lay, as in not even recognized lay leaders, but normal people who had the temerity to do something without permission. I know.
How dare they?
How dare they? It will never last.
Yeah, yeah, and that's been a huge issue in the church, you know, and its widest sense. The kind of how dare they? You know, what do we do? There's an example I've seen recently where somebody just started an online church, and somebody said, yeah, but who's supervising that? You know, and you're kind of like, you know, where does that fit into our structure? Who's, you know, and there are, you know, over the years we've seen huge issues around about accountability, which are real. You know, we've had some, you know, pretty disastrous examples of fresh expressions that have gone badly wrong because there was no oversight and accountability. But that's a very different thing from saying to somebody, I'm really sorry, you just can't do that because you haven't studied theology for 3 years. Or
Indeed. And it, you know, in a sense it was ever thus. I mean, if you look back at the Reformation, okay, you've got the big three, obviously, you know, Luther, Calvin and Zwingli, but then you've got the Anabaptists. And, you know, okay, you get Munster, you know, you get a kind of fairly bad example, but that's the bad apple, if you like. It's the bad example. I almost tend to say, I think the Holy Spirit is the one that does the accountability and oversight, actually. But most people actually who are, I think, of a pioneer mindset want accountability. They want relationship accountability. They don't want someone bossing them, but they really do want people supervising and overseeing and helping them. Yeah. I've just finished the 5th round of an introduction to pioneer ministry that I've been running like the rest of the world has on Zoom. And I started it back in June, very tentatively, thinking, well, if pioneer ministry is about anything, it's about starting from scratch. And if we are in any kind of moment right now, we're in a moment for starting from scratch. So I wonder whether the pioneer ministry ideas might be something that some people might be interested in. And I had no idea whether it would be of interest. So I kind of thought, well, I don't want to do a big thing. I want to do a fairly interactive thing. So I'm going to cap it at 12 people. But I also did it so that if I only got half a dozen people, I could still say, well, I sold half the spaces. I mean, it's free, but, you know, I'd feel okay about myself rather than saying 50 people can do it and only half a dozen people sign up, and then I would feel really depressed. And the first one was fully booked in 3 hours. Like I went live with it on Facebook and 3 hours it had gone. And I was like, people going, you know, it's full. What's going on? Are you going to do another one? And I was a bit like, oh, crumbs. So I sort of looked at my diary and realized I could fit another one in before the summer break. And I advertised that on Facebook the next day, and that was full within 4 hours. And I had another waiting list. And I ran a third one starting August and another one starting September, another one that I've just finished. So I've had 60 people from across Scotland because I keep it capped at this dozen. And the breakdown's been really interesting. I would break it down into, now I work for the Scottish Episcopal Church, so that's been the primary network I've been pushing it in. It's been 40% SEC clergy, 30% SEC laity, and 30% ecumenical others. You know, so for the purpose of this conversation, you're one of the ecumenical others, so you're welcome. You know, but I'm delighted at that mix. You know, because that's very generative in itself. But it's been church leaders who've come along to this going, do you know, I didn't sign up for most of what the ministries have been doing. I want to do stuff differently. I just need some ideas. Yeah. And then amongst the laity, it's been some actual already people pioneering who just want a bit of training, and a bunch of people who are aspiring but just want to help to kickstart it. And that's been true across the denominations. That's been the pattern.
Uh-huh.
And I now have a learning set that meets once a month from those courses of people who are now actually starting things. And I'm kind of creating a little peer support group. It's experimental. I'm saying to people, this is about, well, I think it's good to think of pioneer ministry as the research and development arm of the church.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a silver bullet, do this and you will live. It's try some stuff and see what God does. Because we were already in an era of needing to rethink what we were doing, because a lot of it wasn't working awfully well, however we define that, but it wasn't. And now we've finally got the time and the space to do it. And the people were out there and I've grabbed onto just a little bit of help and support and a few ideas. And the feedback I've had has been so encouraging to what people have gone away with and what they're now going to do and put into practice. And obviously I'm now still in touch with a bunch of them because we're meeting monthly, but others have said, I don't have time to do the group, but I'm doing this and I'm working on this in my church and we're now starting an XYZ. And I'm just amazed really and excited. It's sowing some seeds, but who knows what God will do. Yeah,
there's a kind of an amazing, you said earlier on, you used the word permission, and people look for permission. So when somebody comes along and says, this is okay, you'll go and try that. And I've always thought some of that's around about permission to fail as well as permission to succeed. That people are terrified that something doesn't work.
Yes. Absolutely. That permission to fail is really, really important. Really important. It's something of a commonplace. Nobody really knows where it comes from. And I was even told this by my bank manager when I started my own management consultancy business 18 years ago. 4 in 5 new initiatives fail within the first 5 years. It's just a commonplace. Nobody really knows where, but people accept it as a reality, and it's shared because it seems to be true. So that means lots of things don't work out, but you still learn stuff while you do it. I finished a PhD last year where I researched entrepreneurial leadership in the church in Scotland, and I basically looked at pioneering initiatives and pioneering church leaders and church planters and people who started charities and social enterprises. And one of the key findings, much more important than I even expected it to be, was the importance of difficulties, the importance of mistakes, the importance of failure, and learning to redefine failure. There's never actually such a thing as failure. You will always learn something, even if all you've learned is we're never doing that again.
Yeah, and I suppose that's been the problem though, hasn't it? That loads of churches have tried something once and it didn't go very well, so we've never done it again. Nobody sat down and said, so what happened?
Yeah.
Why didn't it go well? Ask the people who did come what they thought about it. Just, you said earlier on, you didn't set your target participation level in the course at 50. Well, maybe that was the problem. Maybe all we've done is expected that 1,000 people are going to turn up, and that's unrealistic. And, the 20 people that came had an amazing experience and it was really valuable for them. And they're really disappointed we're not doing it again.
Right. Absolutely. Yep. Or it wasn't quite what they wanted, but it was good enough. But actually, if we tweaked it a bit or we tried something slightly different. Yeah. But I think you're right. What we do is we try something, it doesn't work and we get burned. So we kind of, we retrench, and we oh gosh, we better just go back to what we know. But
because we don't have a tradition of reflective practice for a kind of
absolutely better. Basically that's a fundamental issue, and pioneer ministry in some ways is the application of community learning and development principles to Christian mission. Really, that's all it is. If you look at some of the pioneer ministry literature and its methodologies, you could look at community development and go, it's the same thing. It's going, listening, learning. What do the people there want? How can we make it happen? Stuff really well. Yeah. It's really just forgive me, put it this way, it's just applying it to growing up church, not young people. That's all the difference, really. Yeah. It's a different demographic that you're working with.
Yeah.
And just moving tentatively, moving humbly. I think that's the thing. This rewards our humility rather than our arrogance. We're not going to fix the world or fix the church through this stuff, but we might learn some stuff that might be useful to us and others that we can then share with each other and support each other as we emerge blinking into the daylight and try and work out what the heck the future holds,
it feels like pioneer ministry is much more collaborative than perhaps traditional ministry has been. I'd always feel we're a bit competitive. And even the kind of rush to online, we're still, oh, I'm getting more viewers than you're getting, and all that kind of stuff.
It's enormously collaborative. And I mean, there's a real move away from what's called the heropreneur, the heroic entrepreneur individual who will come and save things. Because we've seen some business failures recently this week that embody that, that's not, I love the phrase in some of the literature, talk about that the best pioneering emerges in a socially supportive culture, where people know people who are willing to work and say, I like your idea, I could help you with that, or can I pick your brains, or you should talk to them because they'll be able to help you. And it is more collaborative and emergent. I mean, there is plenty of scope for ego within it, absolutely. And my idea is better than your idea, kind of thing. But if we can take the best of it, I think it has something very helpful and valuable. Yeah. Something else I've been mulling over in sort of recent weeks has been, but what about the people for whom even that's a bit of a step too far at the moment? Because, contrary, I think, to all of our expectations, we're not in a new normal in the autumn at all. We were warned about a second wave and didn't really believe it. And then my word, hasn't it hit hard, and, you and I are both in level 4 regions, we're allowed out of the gulag for our state-sponsored 5 minutes of exercise, and that's about it. I mean, it's pretty severe stuff, and it needs to be that way, and it's going to be that way for quite a while. And so we're actually kind of on hold for quite a long time. So I think quite a lot of the pioneering stuff, we can try some experiments now, but actually most of this probably won't bear fruit until we're actually beginning to emerge into the new normal. Maybe, hopefully, by the summer. Let's hope that, with the vaccinations and that. But I have also been thinking a bit about, what do you do when everything's on hold? What are you just have to tread water? Is that it? And I think there's more you can do. I've been quite taken by the work of a guy called Carl Weick in the work of sense making. And there's a book that came out last year by Susan Beaumont called How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going, which is actually quite a good example of sense making. It's quite a programmatic book. It's quite in these situations, do these steps. And there's another book that's just come out in Scotland, Rewilding, well, in the UK, in Scotland, Steve Aesop's book, Rewilding, which is another example of the same thing. It's much more metaphorical and suggestive. He deliberately does the opposite and said, I'm not going to give you steps to follow. Yeah. I'm going to just give you some metaphors to play with. But in different ways, they're all trying to engage with this question of, when we're not sure what to do and actually we can't do very much, what can we do? And I really like what the Beaumont talks about, tending the soul of the institution. And she doesn't mean tending the soul of the people like most pastors. Oh, that's good, I'll just look after the people. It's, let's look at who we are. Let's work out what God's made us to be. Like God said to Moses, what have you got in your hand? Or as I really, really like Dave Mail in his book on pioneering says, if you want to cook a meal, there's 2 ways of doing it. You can look at the recipe and go and buy the ingredients, or you can say, what have I got in my fridge? Yeah. And asking ourselves, what's in our fridge? What have we got at the moment? So for any given church, who are we? What have we got? What are our gifts? What are our skills? What are our passion, our calling? Let's spend some time on that. Not to become narcissistic and self-absorbed, but in order to prepare ourselves for what might come and what the future is going to hold. But in organizational terms, it says, let's build some capacity. Yeah. I've noticed how many church leaders have done series on what is the church this autumn. It's been, as I've seen it on social media, it's been shared. And I think instinctively that's, people have grasped, are doing the right thing there. Yeah. They're saying, okay, we can't do anything else. Let's go back to first principles. Who are we meant to be as God's people? Yeah. And let's just put down some roots again and get hold of that again and talk about it as a church and be prepared then for when we can get out into the daylight. And I would say within that, invest in training now, invest in capacity building, invest in nurturing your people, but equipping them ready for what the unknown that's going to emerge next year, the year after.
I remember speaking to a young woman who was leaving education. She just finished university, and I was having that kind of, so what are you going to do now? And she was quite firm that she was going to work out who she was going to be.
Right.
And was going to kind of work out the principles by which she might make decisions and live her life. And I just thought that what an incredible attitude,
isn't it?
Particularly for a person. Particularly for somebody of her age.
Indeed, for any person.
But for anyone, but as an organisation and as a community, to be able to work out who you are is really, really important, because that then informs what you want to do, rather than saying, what can we do? Which is, I think, what we do all the time, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is. It's all about what can we do, rather than, I mean, in a way, it's another approach to organisation development. You could start with what are the needs, or you can start with who are we. In a previous job down in England, I was the chief exec of a church planting mission agency, and I joined it in its 100th year anniversary. It was an old organisation, and it had nearly gone bust the year before, and it, staff morale was very low. Missionaries, because it was worked around Europe, were uncertain, and basically I think we've just got to really focus on who we are. And I used the verse from Isaiah 54, enlarge the place of your tent, stretch the tent curtains wide, do not hold back, lengthen your cords, strengthen your stakes. And I said, look, this is what we need to do at the moment. We need to, I didn't know Beaumont's phrase, but I was tending the soul of the institution. Yeah. And focusing, in that case, it involved financial capacity as well. We grew it. We grew the income by 50% in 4 years, or 6 years. But we had to focus on who we were, work on training, work on capacity, work on identity. As individuals, I think it's a brilliant idea, but as churches, and I think, the thing is we don't need to go very far to find these metaphors in the Bible. We've got the whole new wineskins language that Jesus gives us. We don't need to have a blueprint. I absolutely love Hebrews 11:8. Abraham left his home city and set out on a journey, even though he didn't know where he was going. Yeah. That's a very freeing text, and it's in Hebrews 11, which is, it's the pilgrimage chapter. It's the heroes of the faith that are held up to us as an example of how we're meant to live. Yeah. So we don't have to have the answer. Well, what are we going to do then? Well, we don't know yet. But who does? Nobody knows. But we can start on the journey, and the more we can travel together, and going back to your point about, talking about it with other church leaders or, fellow Christians, and picking each other's brains, rather than making it some kind of, rush to the front, I'm going to come up with a solution before you do kind of nonsense. The better, really, because we can learn together. Comes back again, this is a time for learning, a time for admitting it's not gone well. And taking time to try a few things and see what God does.
Yeah, in some senses, a pandemic completely lets us off the hook.
Yes.
It's not my fault that stopped. There's always that kind of, there's always things that go on in the church. You think, why are we doing that? Can we just stop? And it's really difficult to stop because someone's really, really invested in it.
Yes.
And now everything's stopped. And it wasn't my fault.
Yeah.
So, can we just have that conversation about what's important? And we will pick some of the things up because they're really important and we should do them. But there are other things that we
could just let go. Yeah, and it may be that actually some of the people that spent 20 years maintaining something will be quite relieved, actually, because they've not wanted to admit, or even to themselves, that actually this has been a bit of a burden. And it's going back to, let's not all rush back to the beach as quickly as we can. Let's not rush back to business as usual. But let's think about trying to do things differently, do things in a very different way. I really like this. I mentioned this idea of reframing, which comes from a concept called design thinking, which is a structured way for developing entrepreneurial and pioneering ideas, rather than sort of sitting around and dreaming and hoping that inspiration will strike. There are ways of structurally exploring ideas, and reframing is a good one. And it's really telling the old story in a slightly different way. And the example I often give is, I mentioned about this organization that I went to in its centenary year, and it, Christian mission organization of 100 years age, had its glory days. It was shrinking. The finances were difficult. Finances were dropping. It had nearly gone bust the year before. They'd had to make some big cuts. They brought in an interim chief exec for 9 months who'd kind of done the significant pruning, and then I came in to kind of then try and rebuild it. And I was very grateful to the guy who'd done all the difficult stuff and the unpopular stuff, because it meant I didn't have to. But I remember saying, and I was genuine in this, but I was amazed what happened. I said, look, we're not the only organization facing this. We're just one of the first that's hit the buffers. Maybe instead of thinking us, instead of dealing with this, we're rubbish, we're declining, we're old, we don't know what to do, maybe we need to rethink of ourselves as, actually, let's go off and try and work out what the new normal looks like. That phrase, I didn't use it. That the new. If we were starting from scratch now, what would we do?
Yeah.
And maybe we could be the people that work it out that others can learn from. And I was amazed at the galvanizing power of that way of thinking, because all of a sudden people said, yeah, instead of being like the old rubbish organization that fell over, we could be the people that help create something new that others might then benefit from what we learn from. Yeah. And it just, I was completely gobsmacked about how that caught fire, if you like, amongst the staff and the missionaries, and kind of gave them a sense of confidence and purpose. And all I'd done is reframe the situation. Nothing had changed. It was just that, rather than being at the bottom of a downhill slide, we're at the start of a new uphill climb.
Yeah.
And just that metaphor completely changed people's mindsets and gave them energy and excitement, and in a sense became a bit self-fulfilling. Yeah. Now, it could be a bit of game playing, but it wasn't. It was a genuine metaphor that I used, and it completely caught me by surprise. But it did the job.
It does work, and we see it in all kinds of situations. We see it in advertising. So whenever it was in the 1980s, the TSB was the bank that liked to say yes. Now that's a completely nonsense statement. They didn't give out any more loans. They didn't say yes any more regularly, but they liked to say yes. And so that frames them as a positive, friendly, helpful kind of bank. Yeah. The Boys Brigade did exactly the same thing a couple of years ago when they declared that they were a growing organisation. Now, they were. Not much.
But they were.
But they grew significantly because, they're a growing organisation. We should go and join them. There's obviously something happening over there. Yes. And they start to give out, certificates to companies that have got 3 extra boys that have come along. Oh, look at us, we're a growing company. That's brilliant. Well done. Maybe we're not going to decline. Maybe we're not going to go out, And
it's the stories we tell ourselves.
Huge.
Yeah, it is. It's the stories we tell ourselves. I've started saying the same in relation to churches. There's a world of difference between a church of, let's say, 25 to 30 people that are looking back to a glorious future behind them, and they remember when there used to be 80, 100, 120, and we had 30 kids in the Sunday school and all that. And now, if you're a church plant of 25 to 30 people, that's a really solid place to start. Church plants don't often start with that many people. Now, to do that, you might have to do something really radical, like sell your building, or you might rechange your building to be something completely different and not your primary meeting place. You might turn it into a community facility. There might be money involved. You might just say, do you know what? Let's just start again. Particularly, demographics change. Churches not located in the same location. There is a good argument. There are disadvantages to meeting in schools, but there are a good argument for churches meeting in schools, particularly if you want to reach families, because families are used to their kids going to that school and going to that school building. They're not used to going to that weird church building that they never cross the threshold and don't know what goes in there. So being in a more publicly accessible and welcoming building, all you've done is rethink yourselves from a declining church to a church plant, but it can create its own momentum and positivity. Slightly more radically, I'm really taken. I don't know anyone who's done this, but I'm really taken with something that a guy called Simon Sutcliffe said. He was a Methodist Church Venture FX pioneer. He now does in England the same job that Lorraine Darlow does for the Methodists up here in terms of learning and development. And he said, it was a bold statement, but he said he was convinced that in the future most churches would behave more like social enterprises than group meetings.
Okay.
And I thought, that's very interesting. You know, it's a bold statement, but at the moment, our primary metaphor of church operations is a group meeting. That's what we do. We meet as groups. What if our primary metaphor was we're a social enterprise? We're still going to meet, but what we do when we meet and how we meet and why we meet is going to be very different. Now, the role of a minister in that is still to resource people, educate, train. There's going to be worship involved because it's a Christian community. But wouldn't that be a very different way to gather and exist in a town, if you know, than we're a group that meets? It reminds me of something that I heard Mike Frost say many years ago in London, that as churches we do four things. We do worship, we do fellowship, we do mission, and we do discipleship, you know, personal growth, spirituality. And we use the worship service, we use the worship as the thing around which the other three things happen. Mission, fellowship, and discipleship, you know, personal group and outreach. What if instead of worship being the hub, what if mission was the hub and our worship and fellowship and discipleship happened around mission? And it was the same metaphor, just expressed in a very concrete way. I'm aware that what I've just said there is quite a radical reordering and rethinking of church, and it's better than give us as a thought experiment, really. I realize that many churches and most church leaders will go, that's not what I'm trained for, it's not what I'm called for, it's not what I'm gifted for. And I want to say, possibly not, but maybe you are. And actually, are the things you're doing really working anyway? Why not rethink? Why not push these thought experiments and see where we get to a bit, to rethink what it means to be the church in the UK in the 21st century? Because as one of the people I interviewed for my PhD said to me when I interviewed them, the way we're doing it at the moment is not exactly bringing them in their hordes. No, and
I guess what you're asking us to do is to think about things that we're always really, well, I have the sense that we're uncomfortable about thinking about things like outputs. You know, well, what is it? You know, if we're talking about entrepreneurship, then entrepreneurs are judged on how many units they sell or how many things they make and what kind of profit they bring. And those are really uncomfortable kinds of words for the church. But actually, we measure ourselves in those kinds of things all the time. You know, how many people come? How much money do we make? You know, actually, that's what we do all the time. So
we have metrics anyway, don't we? Yes, we do. And so, yes, often what can happen is that this gets dismissed as business speak. But as you say, we do it anyway. I think actually you can reframe it and say, no, I'm talking about fruitfulness here. That's a, you know, biblical metaphor. Jesus, of course, says that if we don't bear, John 15, if we don't bear fruit, we're going to get pruned. He then goes on to say that those bearing fruit also get pruned so they can be more fruitful. So everyone gets pruned. But we are at least warned that, you know, we are expected to bear fruit. And that does make us uncomfortable. And fruitfulness is quite useful because it gets us, you know, it's not about bums on seats, but it is about, are we making a difference for Christ? Are we making a difference in people's lives? Are people coming to Christ? Are they going deeper in him? Are communities being transformed, you know, to become places that are more peaceful and loving and you know, there's all sorts of things that I think we want to see happen as the church. I think what I'm pushing at is, I'm actually in a sense pushing at our rituals in the broadest sense of our practices, that we have these deep, warm grooves of practice that we assume that to be the church is to attend a building at a certain time and have a meeting, sitting in rows, with some slightly enforced social interaction at some point that might be called the peace or might be say hello to the neighbour next to you. But largely it's a fairly passive enterprise with a bit of community singing and listening to people from the front and then a quick chat after coffee and scurry off home. There are other ways to be the church. And a lot of what I'm not all the ones I'm pushing. I'm not saying they're the only ones, but the metaphors I've been pushing or the ideas are saying, let's think about other ways of being church and push it back to what we're here for. Why it comes back to what's saying it. Why has God created a church? What's the point of the people of God? Why did God call Abraham to follow him? Why did he create Israel to be, you know, ultimately to be a light to the nations, originally Israel? And then through the Messiah, people from every nation are called to be that light to the nations and to be the people of God that are created to serve the whole world, but to also make God known and invite others to know him and worship him. I mean, it's fundamental Christian identity stuff. And we do have this opportunity right now to draw breath. You know, we've taken the car off the road, it's in the garage, or we're sat in the services, or I don't know how far to push this metaphor, but let's take some time. Let's take some time to really rethink what we're about. And I come back to the fairly blunt observation, because we're not exactly cutting it anyway. I'm not saying we should be stopping a really successful bunch of things, but we've actually got some time to think now.
Yeah, to push the metaphor far too far. You know, the engine's gubbed, the tires are worn out, the exhaust burst. You know, it's a car, but
yes,
only in name only.
Yes. I suppose you could even have maybe we don't need a car.
Well, yeah, and I think that's the, I suppose, the thing that we're terrified of, isn't it? That, you know, we can't, you know, for most of, I live in a village where the majority of people who come to our church have either lived here forever or have chosen to live here fairly recently. So we've got kind of two groups of people, which is fascinating. And the people who have lived here forever, this is pretty much the only church they've ever been to, because, well, why would you go anywhere else?
Yeah.
So their experience of church is what happens in that building across the road. They don't have an experience where they've been to lots of different churches, where they've seen lots of different things, except fairly recently where they've been able to visit other churches, which has been brilliant.
Yes.
You know, and I've tried to really encourage that. Go and see what, you know, the folk down the road are doing and across here, and because some of that allows us, when we come out, to say, actually, there's a church along the road that's doing messy church. Why on earth would we compete with that?
Right. Yeah, they're doing it. So
they're doing it. Would, you know, can our kids go there, or can we work together with them so that we're not reproducing resources and effort and all that kind of stuff? But I suppose the point is that it's very difficult for people to imagine something different.
Yes.
If that's all they've ever known.
Yes,
you know,
indeed.
And your use of Abraham is that, you know, I think Abraham was absolutely incredible, you know, to just pack up and go. And nobody did that.
Right.
You know, it wasn't even a thing that, you know, people go off occasionally. No, they don't. You know, they stay together because there's safety in that, and they consolidate the land that they have. Nobody goes, you know, especially when you don't know where you're going.
Yeah. And you understand, don't you? It's scary, really.
Yeah.
But as you say, we've got the opportunity now. You know, we're not like Abraham. You know, we have Google Maps. we know where we're going. As it well, we can go and find out. We can look ahead. We have Street View. You know, to push the metaphor a bit further. Like you say, people have got the opportunity to go and learn what other people are doing. And I've always thought that creativity is basically pinching a good idea from somewhere else and seeing what we can do within our own situation. You know, Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. We don't have to come up with something radically new that no one's ever thought of, because it's not going to happen. But it's a bit of something from here and a bit of something from there, and then we do our own thing with it, and we come up with something that's right for us. But again, if that, you know, and I suppose it's the recipe analogy or the cooking analogy, you know, if all I've got in the fridge is 4 eggs and 4 onions, then all I can make is an onion omelette. You know, maybe I need to get some ham in or some cheese. You know, we bring a few other bits and bobs in and try again. And the first time wasn't so great, but then let's have another go and see if we can come up with something else, and kind of have a culture. And I think this is really important, probably for church leaders, but any church really. Who are the heroes? Who are the people whose stories we tell and who we celebrate amongst our own communities? Who gets kudos? Who you know, do we say, you know, look at what X has been doing in our church, and okay, you know, it didn't work out as they wanted, but they learned this, and we're now going to do this as a result of it. Can we celebrate the people that are willing to push the boundaries a bit, rather than see them as I wish they'd just sit down and shut up. You know, we might not even agree necessarily what they're doing, but they may help to create a philosophy and a culture that helps others to go, well, I didn't want to do that, but I wanted to do this. I wonder if I could have a go, and would the church support me in it? And are we going to be the church that likes to say yes? I suppose is the end question, really.
One of the things I really like is when people creatively misuse other things. You know, so most of the best kind of things that folk develop are when they take something that is for something else and say, oh, what if we used it for this? Text messaging is the famous kind of example. SMS was a short message code for engineers to send messages to each other. Now we can't live without WhatsApp and Messenger and all that, but that's where it came from.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a great example is, Messy Church. Who knew that colouring in for Jesus was going to be such a big thing?
Yeah.
But it's a big deal. Yeah. And, for many of the people involved in it, that's now their church.
Yeah.
And what I love about the folk at Messy Church is they're very self-critical. So they've been aware that discipleship, people coming to faith and going deeper in Christ is not easy in a Messy Church context because it's so, activity focused. So they're like, right, what are we going to do about this? We're not going to be defensive and pretend it's all great. We're not going to or spin it that, well, that's not really about. They're going to say, we've got so far, but we want to keep learning. We've we've learned a few things, but we've discovered some flaws or some weaknesses. Right, what are we going to do about it? And they commissioned Church Army to do a major bit of research. So they brought in outsiders to do the analysis. That's vulnerable. But they brought in other people to do the analysis to help them learn. They brought, an external point of view in. That takes humility and vulnerability to make yourself vulnerable. But also there's some strength of character there to say, but we're willing to learn because we want to be doing better, rather than pretending everything's rosy. I have huge admiration for them, not just for what they've started, but for the philosophy they're continuing with. And I think we can learn a lot from that kind of mindset. Yeah,
that outside voice can be hugely important for us, can't it? And it's something that we're always a bit wary of, that kind of, well, what do they know?
Yeah.
We're doing this because, we know best and it's ours. And, and actually, to have someone come and look at what you do and say, have you thought about that? Why do you do that? It goes all the way back to that tending the soul thing. Part of that's about asking those questions, isn't it? Why do we do this in the way that we do it? And what's it for?
Yes.
How does it feed us, or does it drain us, or does, all those kind of.
Yeah. And it doesn't necessarily have to be an expert that you bring in, In fact, I think it's better if it's kind of peer led. And it's not necessarily that the other person's better, but a different point of view. A different point of view that says, like you say, have you thought of X or Y? And usually then it becomes reciprocal, because if you do it in the context of trust and relationship, you'd also be doing the same with them. This is where peer traveling, peer learning. I mean, we talked about pioneering as a kind of collegiate act, but this for me has been one of the things with this learning set I was talking about earlier, that there's just a bunch of people who they're all making it up, but they're willing to be kind of vulnerable with a bunch of other people who are making it up because they kind of know they're all in the same boat, and they've found some kindred spirits. And it's a mix of lay pioneers and some church leaders, it's a mix of both, but they're all willing to be vulnerable with each other about their questions, their challenges, the things they're trying. Because it's a learning set, people ask each other questions, they go away, they put ideas into practice, and they've already been coming back saying, I tried, I did what we talked about, I tried it, I learned this. So we all learn together.
And some of that cultural changes that moving away from this idea of the kind of the leader as the expert. We've for years and years and years, we've trained people in theology and then put them on a pedestal, literally, and told them to lead churches as though doing an academic course makes you a leader, and so what you're finding, I think, is fascinating, because it's about people who have been given that status sitting with people who have none, and learning from each other, and the vulnerability involved in that is hugely beneficial.
Yeah, Richard Arbuckle is I think he's a Kiwi, he's a Jesuit writer who's written a lot on refounding the church, and he's written from a Roman Catholic context. To put it this way, no friend of John Paul II or Benedict XVI, let me put it that way. Very much a pro-Vatican II kind of guy. And in one of his books, he talks about authority dissenters and pathfinding dissenters. And what he means is that we need dissenters in the church, but there are two types. There are dissenters in the position of authority who can open the way for the pathfinders who will go and make it. So the role of a church leader is really important in this, because they can be the authority dissenter, because they do have a lot of authority and they do have a lot of power in an average congregation. I guess most church leaders probably don't think they do, but they do. and to lend their authority, positional or personal or whatever it is, to endorse some of the stuff that might frighten the natives otherwise, is enormously powerful ministry. And that's where this partnership between, dreadful phrase, but clergy and laity is really healthy and important. It's not about dethroning one group to enthrone another. It's saying there are different gifts and contributions. The pathfinding dissenter might be the minister sometimes, and the authority dissenter might be the minister, but it might be, all churches have got patriarchs and matriarchs and powerful families that may or may not have any official authority. In fact, some of the most powerful ones have no official authority. Yeah. But there's no nepotism in this church, and my sons will make sure of that kind of thing. Yep. But they can be remarkable permission givers as well, rather than guardians of the status quo. What they can be, and some of the best, and I've benefited in the past in my own Christian journey, particularly as a young Christian, from people like that who used their authority to create the way for this young upstart who had no clue what he was doing, to go off and try and learn a few things while he did it. And I, now find myself in a position of being able to do that again, or do that now for a different generation. And it's a joy to do it.
Yeah. And Richard, we're almost at the end of our time, and I'm going to do a thing that I've never do with people. But I'm going to ask you the kind of sum it up in a sentence kind of thing. What do you think in this period of time? So kind of looking forward to Easter, I think, is probably when things might change. What's the one thing that we should be doing? If folk are sitting watching this in a church, what is it you would advise at the moment?
Gosh, well, I think I want to put it into two sentences, because you're talking about sort of a few months ahead. Between now and Easter, I think it's, what have you got in your fridge is the first question. Or if you want a biblical phrase, what have you got in your hand? Who has God given you in your church, in your hearts, in your community, Christian community, that you want to be, and for the future? Spend some time tending the soul of the body of Christ, the institution. That would be the first thing. And then I think for Easter and for afterwards, my second thing would be, go and try something different and see what happens. And then do it again. Yeah. And then do it again. And think of it as
talk to some people about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Be experimental, try stuff and see what happens, but keep that philosophy going. So spend some time, if you like, on what have we got in our fridge? What have we got in our hands? Who are we? And then, from Easter onwards, which I think is a good watershed moment, I suspect, in our country, never mind just the church, go off and try some different things and see them as a learning process.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a fascinating conversation. It's always good to speak to you. So thank you for your thoughts with us.
Thanks so much.